listening to What Matters on Radio Castledermot with John Phelan.
Good evening, folks, and you're very welcome to another What Matters here on Radio Castledermot. I'm delighted to see so many people on, and like I say, you're all very welcome. Delighted to welcome here this evening Ger Whelan, and this evening Ger is going to talk to us about his book, ''𝒂𝒕𝒕𝒆𝒔, which is all about people from Castledermot and the surrounding areas who fought in World War I. Ger is originally a Castledermot man, and a lot of Ger's family are still living here in Castledermot, born and bred in Abbeylands. So you're very welcome, Ger, to Radio Castledermot.
Thank you, John.
So Ger, your book, maybe you might tell us, what's your book called, and briefly, what's the book about?
Yeah, okay. Well, I titled it ''𝒂𝒕𝒕𝒆𝒔 because of many things in national and local history. We kind of blotted out the First World War because of its proximity to the Civil War and the War of Independence, and how relevant it was when these guys came back was probably minimal. So they tend to get forgotten, and hence why I call it the Forgotten. And basically what it does, it covers everybody in, say, Moon, Castledermot, Levistown, all the way out, say, to Ballyburn and all the rest of it. And the whole idea was for anybody who lived in Castledermot at that time or had a real connection to the town is in the book.
Oh, very good. And Ger, back, when all these Irishmen, and like we're saying, we're talking about the ones from Castledermot, but was it common for people to join the army back then?
It was enough, and strangely, South Kildare was always a great recruitment ground for the British Army, and as you know, even in the Irish Army, I mean, a lot of South Kildare men that we went to school with are serving and that sort of stuff. So there's always been a history in Athy and Castledermot and thereabouts to sign up. I think per head of population, more people signed up in the town of Athy than anywhere in Great Britain.
Right, very interesting. All right, and I suppose, Ger, the book, like we say, is about World War I. And can you tell us, when did World War I begin, and how did Castledermot really react to the breakout of World War I?
Well, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the war when it actually came about. It's probably been about 100 years since anybody had been involved in a proper war. So there was quite a lot of enthusiasm. Also, I mean, locally the economy expanded greatly. The horse fair that was held in Castledermot brought a lot of British Army buyers to the area. But in terms of the local people, yeah, take-up was very strong to join the army, and obviously there had been some people from the village that were either in the army or in the reserves, and they were snapped up straight away and sent. Like, I mean, I think sort of when the British got involved in the war, which was August 1914, or I think it was the 14th of August or the 13th of August, there was already Irish regiments there, and there was at least 8 Castledermot men that I know of were on the boat to France on the day the war broke out. So there's been a lot of army recruitment going on prior to the war itself.
All right, so there was 8 Castledermot people on the boat. So, like, in total, I suppose, or not really in total, but how many from Castledermot, I suppose, saw action in World War I?
I found about 170 odd that had participated in the war, and there's probably about another 25 that I know of, but I couldn't necessarily place it. James Rice of the pub up in the Granite House was Rice's. James, I know, served in the war, but I couldn't physically prove it. But so you're looking at about 190, maybe 200 altogether.
All right. And of that, Ger, how many of those do we know of that died in the war?
Actually, what I found so far, and I don't think I'm missing too many, but at the moment we're looking at 48 being killed from Castledermot and the district thereof, which is quite a substantial number of people.
It is. And I suppose, Ger, the people, from Castledermot who joined, like, what type of backgrounds did all these people come from? Like, were they just normal lads who just wanted to join the British Army and go off and fight in the war, or did some people do it out of necessity?
I was mainly, look, I mean, there was a lot of reasons, but, sort of the vast majority of the people who signed up were landless labourers, who worked on the local estates or, sort of had jobs, with local farmers or stuff like that, very seasonal work. And look, the opportunity, I'd say a lot of reasons why people signed up before the war was, 3 square meals a day, you got paid and you got some clothes and you were kept warm, which was probably more than you could ask for at the time, as a working class man in the Castledermot area,
Yes, yeah. So that was a big motivation then for locals around here in Castledermot to join up.
Yeah, I mean, I very much doubt it was for king and country, put it that way.
Yes. Yeah. And what regiments did people from around here, I suppose, mainly join? I presume there was somewhere, there were some regiments that would have been more common than others.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, the way the British worked was that it's very regionalised recruitment. So in this area, it was the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, which would have covered Meath, Kildare, Carlow, Wicklow, that sort of area. So at least 50% of those who signed up to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. After that, you're probably looking at the Irish Guards, the Leinster Regiment, and the Connacht Rangers seemed to grab quite a few. There was also a regiment called the South Irish Horse, which a lot of them tried to get into because the pay was better in the South Irish Horse as a cavalryman than it was as a soldier. So even that would drive the recruitment, because if you got a shilling a day extra for sitting on a horse, you took a shilling a day extra for sitting on a horse.
Yes, yeah.
As you would.
Yes, yeah. Before, Ger, I'm going to get into some more specifics and some, I suppose, people that you wrote about in the book. But first of all, I just want to thank our sponsor of the show, which is O'Gorman Meats.
O'Gorman Meats, your local winning butchers, serving the local community for generations and proud to sponsor Radio Castledermot.
And folks, today Ger has been very kindly brought in a copy of his book, The Forgotten, which we're talking about here this evening. And so our prize this evening for our competition is going to be a signed copy of the book, and we'll give out the question to that now in a few minutes, so keep tuning in for that. So, Ger, like I say, we'll go on to, I suppose, a few more specifics on the book. And I know from, reading the book and going through the book, and I suppose it's a book that you can pick up and you can read. You can read, some of it, you can put it back down, you can come back to it again. So it's very good that way. And so what I'm planning on doing is I've gone through the book, Ger, and I've just, on different parts, I've just picked out different people, and we just might have a conversation around them and the people who they were, if they died, if they survived, etc.
Okay.
So the first person, Ger, who was the first man from Castledermot to die in World War I?
Well, the answer is quite easy for me. It's William Whelan. Although, having said that, there's quite a glut of Whelans in the book, and not one of them are related to me. But William Whelan was the first man to be killed from Castledermot. Indeed, he was the first resident from Kildare and the first man from Carlow to die in the First World War, because he was actually born in Rathoe, and he came to Castledermot and he married a girl called Bridget Kelly. He married her in February 1914, just before the war had started, and they lived down in Carlow Gate, and I think the Kellys were from Woodlands. And he was one of the first of the eight. He was one of the 8 that were on that boat from Dover to Calais with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and the 1st Battalion. And they got into action. They landed on the 24th, and he was killed in an ambush in 3 days later, in the 27th of August. So his war lasted 3 days. He landed on a Monday, and he was dead by the Wednesday. There were 7 others that were involved in the ambush. 3 were taken into captivity, and 4 managed to escape. and they'd serve out the war. Of one of them would be Robert Jenkinson.
Right, and Robert Jenkinson, folks, and I was talking to Ger about this, and Robert Jenkinson actually has a link to myself, as when Robert came back from the war, he survived the war, and when he came back from the war, he married a lady called Sarah Dorn, and Sarah was an aunt of my mother, Kathleen, and Sarah was actually my godmother. So you can pick up the book, folks, and you can definitely find somebody in there and a link back to yourselves. So maybe you might tell me a little bit about Robert.
Well, I believe he was a Wicklow man from Wicklow town, and a bit of a blow into the Castledermot area. And look, he's quite an exceptional man. There's a few of them in the book, but not many, who was actually involved from pretty much the first day of the war, went through the whole war and survived it. You know, he wasn't even injured. It's quite well, not that we could find that he was injured. So that's quite an accolade. And he went on to serve with the British Army till 1925 because he'd signed up for 12 years. So he had to do his 12. So after 1925, then he came back to Woodlands, and then everything happened after that.
Everything happened, yeah. And he met the great Dorn woman and got married.
As you do.
As you do is right. Yeah. Ger, the last man from Castledermot to actually die in the war, who was that?
Well, yeah, the last man to die actually in the war was a man called Cornelius Ryan. Patrick Cornelius, should I say it correctly. He, again, was a blow-in into the town. His father was an RIC sergeant in the local area, and he signed up and signed into the South Irish Horse, and was in France, and was then commissioned as an officer, and was sent to the East Lancashire Regiment. And he was they had to sort of attack a prison in France that was being held by the Germans, and he was killed in that action, and he died 30 days before the war ended. Now there was two more after that died. John Lawler from the Turnpike, and has many relatives still in the town. He got the military medal for bravery, but it was killed in a train crash in France soon after the war, actually going out on leave. And the very last man to die from the war is another Lawler from out Marshallstown, out that way, Hobartstown. And he died of TB that he had contracted in the war, and he died in, I think, 1919, and he was the last to die that I could find from the war. Though, having said that, a lot of the people who survived the war, if you read the book, they actually died 20, 10, 15 years later, and some of them even died from gas poisoning, but it took 10, 15, 20 years for their lungs to give out. So a lot of them did die from after the war when they came back, just purely from the conditions of the war.
Right, yeah, so like you say, they died because they were in the war, even though they didn't die in the war.
Correct, yeah.
Right, yes, yeah. And Ger, did many people, from Castledermot, many men from Castledermot, see action in Gallipoli? Is it Gallipoli?
Gallipoli, yeah, quite a few. It depended who you were with. The people who were, say, in the Connacht Rangers would have gone to Gallipoli. People who were in the first battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers would have been to Gallipoli. Even though the Aussies and the Kiwis have kind of taken Gallipoli for their own, there was a mass amount of Irish. I think over 5,000 Irish were in Gallipoli at one point, and Gallipoli only lasted about 6 months, from about April till December of 1915. But yeah, there was quite a few there, and the likes of Daniel Hayden, who was a postman in the town after the war, and he had his eye shot out in the war. That happened in Gallipoli. My mother would remember him. Yeah, he just had one eye missing, and his face was a little bit distorted.
Right, yeah.
But a bullet will do that to your face.
I'm sure it would. Yes, yeah. And you talked about James McMahon in your book as well.
Yeah.
James Carey. James, where did he die?
James died in France in the Battle of Fürstenberg, I think, if it's correct. There was a lot of battles that were fought in 1915. 1916 was probably the most detrimental for deaths from Castledermot. And August was the most dangerous month to be a soldier from Castledermot in the First World War, and February was a damn good month because nobody died in February. So it depends what month of the year you were in France, you know.
Yes, yeah. Folks, I'm just sitting here listening to Ger, and I'm at awe. I don't know about ye out there listening, but I'm at awe here with the knowledge that Ger has on World War One, and just want to say that, you know, I'm delighted that he's here this evening and sharing this knowledge with us.
𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒕𝒆𝒔, your local winning butchers, serving their local community for generations, and proud to sponsor Radio Castledermot.
Okay, and a huge shout out and thanks to 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒕𝒆𝒔 Meats for being the sponsor of What Matters and coming on board. Ger, we'll keep going here.
Yeah.
Norman Leslie Hannon. Can you tell us a bit about him and how did the war impact on his wider family?
Yeah, I mean the Hannons owned the mill down the mill road there, down Ballyburn, I suppose. I can't remember what the area is.
Yeah, the Cope's Mill, as we all know it nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. That used to be known as Hannon's Mill. Okay, they were quite a well-to-do family in the area. Actually, two brothers were lost. You had Norman and you also had John Coulson as well, that were both brothers that were killed. It was very devastating. I mean, what's quite interesting is that both of them were officers in the Liverpool Regiment, and is that there's a fantastic amount of history and records available for the officers, but not for the rank and file. And there's many reasons for that. Is that actually in 1940 the Germans blitzed London and they bombed all the records for World War One, so a lot of it went up in flames. So it's very partial, but the Hannons were devastated. I mean, they lost both their sons, and they had a daughter who served as a nurse as well. And then they moved to Uthai, and in Ardley House, and that's where they were based. I think they're long since gone, but yeah, it was quite a thing.
Right. And Ger, you mentioned there, you know, just before we went into our competition about people dying after the fact and from, you know, different things they picked up during the war. But could you tell us, Ger, who the first man from Castledermot that was killed in a gas attack during the war?
That's a question now. I'll have to refer to my notes on that one. Let's see, where were we on that one? Martin Shannon. Martin Shannon. Yeah, I think Martin Shannon was from Bagnallstown originally, actually. And he was living out in around Maganey when he signed up, and in the 1911 census he was in, but his mother was still down there. Yeah, when they unleashed gas, well, it's hard to know who did it first, but when the Germans did it first, there was no understanding of what it was or how to protect against it, and it would devastate the regiment that was hit. And Martin died a couple of days later from the gas attack. And Shinné on scale insofar as, sort of once you got hit with the gas. But there's, like as I was saying, there was many accounts of afterwards where people on their death cert was gas attack during the war was the responsibility for their death.
Right, yes, yeah. And another guy, Ger, who's you wrote about in the book, and I think he was a very interesting character, a man by the name of 𝒂𝒕𝒔𝒂𝒕.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell our listeners how many regiments did Edward serve in?
He served in about 7, right? And his first regiment was the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and he was kicked out of there for being a harmless lunatic, was actually what was written on his report, right? And then he went off, and he had this tendency to join the army and then confess his sins, like, because one of the things they'd ask you, have you ever served before? And he'd go, no. And he'd always put down Castledermot as his main sort of residence, right? And then once he was serving, he would be, he would say, oh, I forgot to tell you I was in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and they kicked me out for being a harmless lunatic, right? And he must have been a lunatic. And like he went over to England and he signed up in a few regiments in England, and at one stage he was actually in 2 regiments at the one time, because he actually went AWOL from one regiment, went over to another regiment and joined that, all right? And then that regiment ended up actually imprisoning him because he was the RIC or the cops over in Kildare were looking for him for some misdemeanors, so and that sort of stuff. But he turned out quite well insofar as he ended up in the East Lancashire Regiment as well, and he was killed in Gallipoli. But within about 18 months of the war starting and him signing, he went from private to sergeant, which is quite a jump. So even though he was quite a messer, but I would imagine in wartime he made a very, very good soldier, which people can do, because a lot of the people that would tend to be signed up are people that necessarily wouldn't be pillars of the community, but to have a really good, sort of ability to wage war and stuff like that. But he was shot by a sniper in Gallipoli, and he was taken to Malta, and that's where he died of his wounds, and he's buried in Malta.
All right. And I know, Ger, from reading the book and all the people who did die, and when our listeners, if they haven't already read the book, and when they do get their hands on it to read, you'd see that each person after they died, there was gratuities or money, I suppose, paid to the families. And I suppose different people got different amounts. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay, well, there's two things going on there. There's the war gratuity, which is basically a life insurance, okay? And that is very relative to the amount of time you're spending in the army. So the likes, say, of William Phelan, he probably would have only got £3 because he was there for 3 days, effectively. It's hardly worth showing up. God bless you, William. Right? But is, sort of the likes of, say, the Hannons, they would have got £60 because they were officers. So it varied in that respect. But also, as well, there was a lot of back pay paid because of the fact that when you're abroad, you didn't get paid because you were out in the field all the time. So all that accumulation of back pay would be given to you as well. And also as well, then if you were killed, you generally a dependence pension was paid, either to your siblings or to your mother or your father or whatever you'd left your will, because the army make you write a will when you go to war. And outside of that, you might have got, if you had some sort of ailment that was, you survived the war, but the ailment was happened in the war, they would pay you a pension as well. So there was a lot of people in Ireland actually on British pensions doing quite well in a time when Ireland was actually quite poor. These guys were actually, by relative standards, were actually doing okay.
All right. Yeah. And there's a question in from one of our listeners, Ger. Joe from the port has a question up. He says, Ger, the death toll in combat was horrendous, but do you know if any of the Castledermot volunteers died of the Spanish flu in 1918? He said his relative died at home after coming back because his son was ill, and he died of the Spanish flu after returning home.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, the Spanish flu wasn't necessarily, sort of a known thing at that time. But yeah, look, I mean, there's accounts in the book of people being discharged from the army because of TB-related stuff or chest-related stuff and that sort of stuff. But yeah, did people die because of it? Yeah, without doubt. But the death cert wouldn't necessarily reflect the Spanish flu.
All right, right, yeah. Ger, how global, I suppose, was World War One? Like in your book, you wrote about Robert Brown. Robert died in Tanzania, and you also wrote about James Corcoran, who he survived prison near Sofia. So I suppose it was fairly widespread, the war, as I suppose it says it was World War.
Well, yeah, I mean, and for Castledermot it most certainly was, because obviously we had the vast majority in the British Army, but we had representation in the Indian Army, we had representation in the South African Army with the likes of Brown. You had a few in the Australian Army, MacDonald in the New Zealand Army. You had a few in the Americans, like Stephen Forrestal was in the American Army, and then you had quite a few in the Canadians. Because what happened was people went off to, obviously emigrated, but but at that time, the call to fight this German tyranny was very strong. So you ended up people from Castledermot who'd went to the four corners of the world coming back to fight. It was quite, I mean, as you would expect from Ireland or from Castledermot. I mean, we get everywhere. So, and we sign up and come back to fight.
And I suppose where, or do we know how far away the furthest people who died and would be buried. Do we know, how far away they are?
Yeah, I mean, Tanzania is by Brown from up Woodlands is the furthest. He's about 12,000 kilometres from Castledermot is his grave. And the sad thing for me is that probably nobody's ever visited that grave. What I did over the last couple of summers is that I've been to every grave from Castledermot in France and Belgium, and I went out to Gallipoli in the summertime, and I put a cross. It's a small thing that I do, but I put a cross on the grave saying "not forgotten" sort of thing. But it's amazing because it's quite, because sometimes I get to places and I know I'm probably the first Castledermot man ever to stand there, and these guys are forgotten, and some of them are well lonely, sort of like bleak sort of places, Gallipoli, it's like the Leitrim of Turkey.
Yes,
you have to have a purpose to get there, and it was quite exceptional, but it's amazing.
Right, I don't think I'll take a trip there. So my next visit to Turkey. Well, I think that's a lovely thing. You're just after saying there, Ger. When you did make the trips, or do make the trips to these graves, that you do put a little cross on saying "not forgotten." And again, when you read the book and you pick up, any page where Ger writes about anybody, and the last two words on every single person is "not forgotten." So, Ger, it's really, a great thing for you to do, and it's really a great read. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend that you get your hands on it, and we will be telling you where you can get your hands on it later on. But for anybody in Castledermot, Seasons Shop have copies of it. So if you haven't already got your hands on the book, you call into Seasons this week and you can get a copy there. Ger, Joseph English, who was he? He was killed in March 1918.
He was. There was two English brothers killed in the First World War, and I'd say most people will probably have a stab at who's related to these English guys around the town. One of them is quite a good singer called Michael, who would have been they would have been his granduncles. Both of them served. Both of them signed up in England. I think both of them were working in England at that point. He was killed in what was called the Kaiserschlacht of 1918, which was the big German offensive. And as it happens, it kind of fell upon the Irish regiments. And you had Michael that was killed in it, and he would have been serving at the same time, probably in the same trench as Noel Cope from up in Arcrona. Noel had lost a brother earlier in the war, William Michael. In 1915, he was serving with the Canadians. And the story is from Simon Byrne, rest in peace. Simon told me that that he remembered the story that Noel was going to go over and sort out the Germans for what they did to his brother.
Right.
But he ended up in their prison. But sure, that's how it goes sometimes.
Yeah. I suppose you're after mentioning Simon Byrne there, so I'll jump on to a man called Robert Byrne.
Absolutely.
Now Robert and I think three of his brothers, if I'm correct, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but were all fought in the war. But could you tell us a little bit about Robert and his three brothers? Yeah,
sure. Thomas was one of the younger brothers, and he was killed in January 1915 in a bombardment. His trenches got bombed, and he was the only one who was killed that day. But that's the way it happened. Another brother of his called Patrick Byrne. Patrick spent most of his life in St. Dimnus. He was discharged from the war in 1916, probably from PTSD or shell shock back in the day. And he came back to Barnhill, and then he was admitted into St. Dimnus and spent his life there. My sister Mary, who was a psychiatric nurse, actually remembers looking after Patrick. Then there was Cornelius. Cornelius was killed at the end of the war. Again, sort of had an inglorious career. He was kicked out of the army before the war, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and I think he signed up then to either the the Connacht Rangers, I think it was, and he got killed near the end of the war as well. And then Robert was quite an exceptional character. Robert signed up to the army when he was 16, and his mother, because he was a couple of years too young for that, at 17 or 17 and a half, so she got on to the local clergy here, both the Protestant and the Catholic clergy, and actually got him released from the army. That was the Leinster Regiment, because he was too young and he was sent home. But as soon as he became 17, he signed back up and went. And he served with the East Kent Regiment, and he served with a couple of, I think he finished up with the Royal Munster Fusiliers, and got shot in the leg near the end of the war. But he came back to Ireland, and he left the army around 1919 or 1920, and he joined up in Carlow for the Irish Civil War and fought the Irish Civil War. Then after that, he came back to Barnhill and settled down a bit. And then when World War II broke out in 1939, again, Simon told me that he remembered going down to the Maganey railway station for Robert to head back to England to serve in the Second World War. So effectively, he fought most of the First World War, the Irish Civil War, and then fought the Second World War. Quite a man. But his father was known as the Soldier Burn, because there was a long history of soldiering in the family. I think they were down from around Bagnallstown way originally, and married into the town. But actually, the Mrs. Byrne, who had the 4 children, actually was married before, and she had another child called James Whelan, who actually signed up for the army as well. So she actually had 5 sons in the army at one point.
Wow, amazing, I suppose. And for us to think back, and that was the life that a lot of women were living here, during the war, that their husbands and their sons were gone to fight, and there was no mobile phones or anything else. Like, you were going months and months on end without knowing, whether your husband, son was alive or dead, or how they were getting on.
Well, there are a lot of instances of letters being written from the mother or the sister saying, "I haven't heard from Johnny in 3 months, can you let me know if he's still alive?" And they mightn't even get a response, because sometimes they'd have to write to the officers in the field trying to say, "Listen, I know Johnny served on you, is he still alive?" But Johnny could have been dead 6 months, and they wouldn't have known.
Yes. A man by the name of Patrick Lawler. Patrick was killed in RMS Leinster in October 1918. Can you tell us a little bit about Patrick?
Yeah, Patrick came from Skennegun. There's quite a few soldiers from Skennegun, strangely, and St. John's in that area. There must have been a lot of houses back there back in the day. But yeah, Patrick was quite a unique case. Now there's a couple. There's a Jeremiah O'Neill from Moon as well, who falls into this. But Patrick was serving in the Connacht Rangers, and then had transferred to the Machine Gun Corps, which is a specialist outfit. And he was home on leave in Castledermot, and he was heading back to the war about roughly a month before the war was to end. And he got on a boat called the RMS Leinster, which was a mail boat, and he was going back to Holyhead, and was hit by a submarine. A good few Irish boats were hit by German submarines back then, and the boat went down, and he drowned and was lost. But because he wasn't lost in the war, he wasn't registered, okay, because his body was never found. There was no death cert, no nothing, right? So when I came across him, I couldn't find a grave for him, and I couldn't find a death cert for him, like from the British Army or whatever, because they issue that sort of stuff. So it turns out that he was actually unregistered. So I got on to these people called In From the Cold, which is an organisation who dig into people who haven't been remembered correctly, and I gave them the information. I got information. I got an email back last month that the Commission of War Graves have now acknowledged that he was war dead, and now he's been named on a plaque or on a monument in England. But at least he's been remembered, where beforehand he just disappeared.
That's amazing. So that he's now been remembered, Ger, just purely from you coming across him and you following up on it. So well done on that.
Well, thank you. But Skennegun was quite the place to hang out, seemingly, because a lot of the ex-soldiers that came back, a lot of the houses along that road there, where we know as Skennegun, were actually ex-servicemen, and they used to sit around and share the stories. And I know there was a lot of friction in the town when they came back, but I'd say Skennegun was fairly safe, given the amount that I think there was 7 or 8 soldiers living in those bungalows along there.
All right, yeah. Yes. I suppose we talked there earlier, Ger, about the reason why people went to the war, and it was for pay for your 3 square meals a day. With people gone to the war, it probably played havoc back here on farm life. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And maybe you have a story in your book which I was reading about Noel Cope's mother and what she did.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, look, I mean, with a lot of people gone, like, I mean, if you're talking, like, say, maybe 200 people, 200 men, young men from the town gone, plus emigration was always a great player for us in terms of that, in terms of leaving the town and going to England and the likes of that for work. What happened was labour was very short, and Noel's mother had a harvest to bring in, but she had no men, because William Michael had been killed in 1915, the father had died in 1916, and now Noel was gone, and Samuel Cope, which people might remember, had gone as well. The two, Noel and Samuel, went together, and they were signed up on the kitchen table, by the way. People think you had to go to an army recruitment office, but the actually army back in 1916 came to you and they'd sign you up on the kitchen table, and away you'd go. So it turned out the harvest was in the field, and it was going nowhere. So she wrote to the Curragh and she said, look, you know, my husband died this year, and my other son, you know, died king and country sort of thing, and now my other son, my last son, and his first cousin are up in the army, and I've no way of bringing the harvest in. I can't get a man in the town to do it for me. And the army actually released them for 1 week, and then within about 3 weeks of that, they were off to France.
Right.
Yeah,
yes,
but they brought the harvest home.
They got the harvest in anyway. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it was well worth her writing that letter.
Yeah. Well, you don't ask, you don't get.
That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
That's it. Yeah. And I think a lot of people from Castledermot, I suppose, are the same, you know, at this stage in life as well. But who was the youngest man connected with Castledermot in World War I?
Well, the youngest man is a fella called Thomas Crone, right? His surname you wouldn't hear. I think they worked for the Hannons or the Wrights out around Plumperstown, okay? And they came in, I think, from down south somewhere, and they had, I think they had 10 or 12 children. But the father died, he was like a footman or a coachman, and he died by 1910 or whatever it is, and then they emigrated to Canada. Now, some of them joined up in Canada. One of them actually came back to Ireland to join a regiment, but quite a lot of them joined. And Thomas Crone was the youngest, and I think he was about 18 at the time. The youngest man to die is Jeremiah O'Neill from Moon, although the family had moved to Dublin by then. And he died from TB that he picked up in the war, but he died in 1916 at home. He actually got a gun wound, but it was actually TB that finished him.
All right.
Yeah.
Right. You mentioned there just a couple of seconds ago about when people came back from the war, and what kind of reception, you know, did the veterans who returned back get in Castledermot?
Well, it wasn't great. Okay, you see, the anomaly was that they went off to the war in 1914 as Redmond's men, and basically what that meant is that after the war, home rule was 32 county home rule was supposed to be given. Right, so John Redmond, who was organising that, said, lads, let's all go off to the war, support the Brits, and then they'll see our loyalty and they'll give us the 32 home rule. Okay, the Ulster Protestants thought the same, by the way, and in reverse, and they sent their men. So, you know, sort of, I've lost the question there. Can you give me back that question? My brain.
You know, what type of reception did they get?
Oh, yes,
you know?
okay.
What was life like, I suppose?
It wasn't great because 1916 came along in the middle. So these guys went off to war on the promise that if we do our bit for Ireland, we do our bit for the British, we'll get home rule. Right, and they all went off in masses. You know, William Whelan was the first guy that was killed in the war. He was a national gun instructor, like for the nationalists, you know, the Irish Volunteers. Patrick Farnan, another man who wasn't mentioned, was a gun instructor for Kilkea, Irish National Volunteers. These guys went off and they're singing the nation once again as they go down the road, right? Because they think they're going to pull it all together and they're going to pull this off. 1916 happens. They come back after the war, and everybody thinks they're traitors, right? So even though they went out for Ireland, but when they came back, they were seen as traitors because things had changed, like Sinn Féin had happened. There was in the Laurels, there was a big plaque naming all the people from Castledermot who'd signed up to 1916, and a few days after Easter 1916, it was tarred and obliterated out there because things had just changed that quickly, you know. So when they came back, it was quite harsh. Now, there's a couple of accounts in the book. One is John Kelly from the top of the town. John had been injured lost his leg in Gallipoli, and he'd come back, and he wrote to the army looking for something to show that he had served in the war and that he was proud to serve for his country, and that when he got that, and he was going to head off to England and he was never going to come back. So that you can only assume that with that sort of a letter, you know, he was getting quite a roasting down the town, I would imagine, about being. Yeah. And Halligan in his book, or is Halligan from Kilkea in you know, Here If I Serve, or Here If I Die, Coward if I Survive, or something is the book. I'm probably doing it an injustice there now, but again, he wrote a lot about, you know, sort of ex-army men calling to the door and getting fed, because there was just nowhere to go and nobody wanted them, you know.
Yes, yeah. I just see Caroline Wall-Dixon has a question up there, Ger, and she just said, if they were missing, were their families looked after or just left with no money? So you might just quickly just mention that again.
Yeah. I mean, if they were missing or if they were killed, there was definitely a pension given out, and the pension would last the rest of your life. Or if you incurred an injury that was quite severe, you would get a pension that lasts all your life. It was if you recovered from your injury, the pension would stop. But if the person was killed or missing, yeah, the likes of Patrick Lawler, his parents would have got a pension. I know that, even though he wasn't recorded anywhere, they knew he wasn't there. You know.
Yes. Yeah. Ger, why was there so many people connected with Castledermot in the war? Like, how come?
Yeah, I think that there had always been a thing for South Kildare to join the army. I don't know what it's about, but yeah. But like as I was saying earlier, like I mean, now when people talk about Athy being the biggest catchment area, I'd say up to this book, all of the people who serve in Castledermot probably were integrated into the Athy numbers. Yeah. So in itself, it was great to get that distinction, because I mean, it absolutely amazed me when I started doing this, because this just started by accident, was that, you know, you'd end up with nearly 200 people from a small village, you know, tiny village, that 200 people would be actually involved in the war. It's fair to mention as well, there was 2 women. There was a Mary Timmins from up in Barnhill who joined the US Army and served in France, and then obviously there was Ernest Shackleton's sister. She also served in the war, and she was quite the lady. She's quite a read. Yes.
She was a nurse, wasn't she?
Yeah. She was quite a senior nurse, and was quite famous in Canada and America for setting up children's hospitals and stuff like that. But quite a ballsy woman, I have to say. You know?
Yes.
And worth to read.
Like ultimately, Ger, we're only talking about a war that happened 100 years ago, which isn't just over 100 years ago, I suppose, which isn't a long time really, and like how, I suppose, were all these stories forgotten so quickly? Like, you know, I suppose nowadays we have the internet and we have everything else which can resurrect them. I suppose, is that just the reason why really we didn't have all that for years?
To be honest, there was quite a lot of shame attached to being in the war and being a British soldier, right? And it wasn't something you went shouting around the town about, right? Look, I've only come across one medal in all the research from like the 200 soldiers. Only one medal is all I've seen, right? And I've seen a few pictures, very few pictures, but there would be ones where the family maybe were quite proud of it, but you had to be secretly proud. You know, it wasn't something that you celebrated or you mourned, you know, over the years. If you did it in the shelter of your own house. But I'd say either the medals were never, because you had to collect your medals, you had to write to the British Army would write to you and say, do you want your medals? A lot of them didn't. They didn't have any use for them. They couldn't wear them down to town. You know? Yes. And you'll notice that a lot of guys who were actually military men after the war actually went back to Britain to live there, because at least that way you didn't have to be ashamed of what you've done.
And so when did the memories and all start resurrecting? You know, when did all this start becoming, what made you interested, I suppose, and you gathering the information? When did all that start?
Well, you know, sort of, I always had it in my head that, you know, there was something missing. Like I did history in university and stuff like that. I've always had a great graw for the old history sort of thing. But it was kind of like, you know, sort of, there was, you have history and then there's a blip, like the First World War never happened and the Second World War never happened. It'd be an interesting study to find out what happened with the Castledermot in the Second World War, but that's a different story. But and I probably won't go near that one, being honest. But the First World War, it was quite amazing that we never talked about it. The rest of the world celebrate the First World War, but we don't. And then sort of. That was in the back of my head. And then I used to live in England, and I used to go across to France on holidays, and you drive past these war graves. I don't know if you've ever done it, but it's certainly worth it because they're fantastic things. And you walk through it and you see the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and you see the Connacht Rangers, and you're kind of going, nobody told me this stuff, right? So then one day, actually, I was on Facebook. I hate to admit it, but I was, right? And there I was on Facebook back about 2013. This thing popped up in the feed somewhere, and I had a list of about 20 or 30 people from Castledermot that were killed in the First World War. I went, oh well, that's amazing. I've never seen that before. And two of them had James and William Whelan, and it turned out to be no relative of mine, but my sons are called James and William, and there's 7 generations in a row of James and William in our families, all the way back to 17. You have to ask Lily that one, but sort of, and that. So that kind of piqued my interest. But then I started digging up, and the more I found, the more revealed itself. And then after a while, then COVID came along, and I thought to myself there might be a book in this. So I rang John McKenna, or spoke to John McKenna, and said, John, I want to send you something. This might be mad. Give me your opinion. And he sent it back. He came back to me and said, listen, there's something really good in this. He said, I'll help you publish it, and et cetera, et cetera. And then, in fairness to County Council, the decade of commemorations, they helped out with the book as well. So, it's been well supported, and I'm glad I did it. There you go.
Very good. And I suppose anybody who reads the book, and I know for one, I'm fairly glad you did it as well, I have to say.
Thank you, John.
And I suppose, Ger, why is it important that, all the stories of the Irish men and women, of course, who served in World War I not be forgotten?
Well, to be honest, I think it was a proud contribution. Look, was the war pointless? Probably was. Most wars are. But, sort of like the rest of the world see this as a great sacrifice of humanity, the stupidity, et cetera, and to be honest, it's getting much more sort of airtime now, sort of, and it's great to do it. I suppose what I wanted to do was just to see what Castledermot did, and it's just a small thing. As I was saying to you before, the money that is made from this book, I would like to put a monument back in this town. That people can come along and see the names. And look, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are still related to these people that were in this book. They probably didn't even know. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I'd say there's nobody, from Castledermot who could pick up that book and not find somebody that they would be related to. And you just touched on it there, Ger, when you said that you hope to put up a commemorative plaque for the people who died from the proceeds of the book. And I know from talking to you, your plan is actually to put up 2 plaques, isn't it?
That's right. What I'd like to do is, obviously, everybody who died in the war, that's the ultimate sacrifice, and I'd like to put that on one plaque. And then the other plaque is to put in all the names of those who served and survived, because they shouldn't be. We tend to remember the dead more than the living sometimes, and I don't want that to go. And there are people who are not mentioned in the book, but the likes of Joseph Summers, who was mentioned in a letter, so therefore I know he served, and James Rice, as I mentioned before. So there'll be more people that were mentioned than were mentioned in the book on the plaque. Okay,
and a big question, Ger.
Yeah.
A big question. Where can the book be purchased?
Currently, it's available in Season's shop, who are kindly stocking it there for local access. It's also available at the publishers, which is the 𝑦𝒑𝒊𝒔𝒂𝒕. And if you order online and you want it post abroad, they will do that for you. So if you want to send a Christmas present and you want to wrap it up nice and neatly, I'll get John McKenna to take care of that for you. And look, there's post and packaging associated to that. It depends where you're posting it. But the book is €15, should I say.
All right, you can see it up there on the screen, folks, where if you go into the 𝑦𝒑𝒊𝒔𝒂𝒕, that's what you'll be greeted with when you go and search for the book. So you can see there it's €15, and we'll put all the links up on our social media, so you needn't go running off and missing a bit of the show to grab a pen or anything else. And so you'll get it on our Facebook page afterwards. We'll put up the links on where the book can be got. But without a shadow of a doubt, if you haven't already read it, an absolute brilliant read, very, very interesting. You know, it really is. And like I say, you can pick up the book, you can read a bit of it and come back to it. You know, you can go flicking through and just pick out certain people, go look for your surname or whatever else. There's a section, the first section in the book deals with all the people who died, and that's all in date order. And then the second section of the book are the people who survived. And like I say, that's how I found Robert Jenkinson, who was married to my godmother. So it was good for me to be able to find somebody. And as well as thanking Ger for coming on this evening and sharing his wealth of knowledge about World War I want to thank Ger for bringing in a signed copy of the book. It would make an absolute brilliant Christmas present for somebody. We're coming up to that time of the year, and an absolute brilliant Christmas present for parents, or even anybody that you think might be interested, because there is a lot of people out there who are interested in the history. I know from talking to people my own age and mightn't have visited history in a while, since you've been in school, and it's just starting to become interesting to all us as well. So we'll put up, like I say, where the book can be bought, harvestpress.ie. We'll put up Ger's email address as well, because you can contact Ger directly. And if you're around Castledermot, it can be bought in seasons. So Ger, thanks a million for taking time out of your day to come into us, because Ger doesn't live locally anymore, folks. So I think, where's it, Ger, you said you were living?
Carrick-on-Shannon.
Carrick-on-Shannon. So it's not just on the doorstep. So thanks a million, Ger, for coming in and for your first appearance here on Radio Castledermot. And so we'll get you back in for your next book.
I look forward to it, John. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a million, Ger. And just while we're coming up for our next guests, I'm going to be joined by Siobhan, Phelan and Peter Behan, and they're going to just tell us a little bit about the Christmas Fair, which is coming back to Castledermot this year. So stay with us. We'll find out on what's on in the Christmas Fair and what's happening on the 3rd and 4th of December. Okay, you're very welcome, Siobhan and Peter. And Siobhan, you are looking very festive. And Leo, I think, is on his way in with a Christmas hat for you there, Peter.
Brilliant, thank you.
And the last Christmas Fair was here in Castledermot, was on the 1st of December 2019. But it's back this year. But there's going to be a few changes from what has happened in previous year. Siobhan, can you tell us, I suppose, first of all, when is the Christmas Fair?
The Christmas Fair is on Sunday the 4th of December, and we are delighted to have it back here now in the centre. Though we have, as you say, made a couple of changes to it this year. This year we're just going to have the fair itself on the Sunday, and Santa is going to continue arriving as the drive-through Santa that we've done for the last couple of years. We just found that during COVID, the drive-through made it possible for children to see Santa in a safe environment, and it's actually worked quite well here in Castledermot, so we've decided to stick with that. And plus Santa's availability this year was a little bit tight on schedule, so coming on the full day on Sunday wasn't fully possible for him, but he is happy enough to be here Saturday night and Sunday night to see the children of Castledermot.
All right, so Santa is going to be on back as we were in the previous 2 years. He'll be here Saturday evening from 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock, is it?
Yeah, 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock on the Saturday, and on the Sunday from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock, because school the next morning, so children have to be in bed. Oh,
children have to be in bed, and you have to be good as well that time of the year, isn't that right?
That's it.
So the changes to the fair itself, there's going to be no outside stalls or no stalls in the marquee outside. Is that right, Peter?
Yeah, well, when Santi is going to be going through the drive-through, that's freed up a lot of room in the centre. So the elves and ourselves are going to be very busy the few nights leading up to that, decorating those rooms and getting those rooms ready for stalls.
All right. So when somebody comes in then this year, once you get inside the door, it doesn't matter whether it's going to be lashing rain outside, you're going to be in the nice warmth of the centre, so it's good for both the stall holders and for the people visiting.
Correct, and we have well over 30 stalls this year, so that's up on previous years, and there is, as you say, everybody be in the nice warm, and thanks to Radio Castledermot, there's going to be a nice atmosphere. We're working on getting some music, Christmas songs and that around the whole centre.
Yeah, well, Peter, I was going to say it later on, but I'm delighted to tell all our listeners that from 12 o'clock on the 4th, Radio Castledermot is going to be broadcasting live from the Christmas fair. So our two legends of Fuzzy and Leo will be here in all their Christmas attire, and they'll be playing the Christmas songs and keeping everybody informed about what's happening at the centre and during the fair. So we're delighted that the two lads are coming on board for that. Siobhan, can you give us a sample, I suppose, for our listeners of what stalls will be here? You know, what can, if I come in through the door on the 4th, what can I buy? What'll be here for me to choose from?
Well, you can definitely buy my Christmas present, that's for starters, John.
Oh, now the pressure is on.
Now the pressure is on. As Peter said, we've 34 stalls booked into the centre, and there's a great range of crafts. There's picture frames, there's timber craft, there's slate craft, there's crochet, there's knitting, there's Osborne books, there's handcrafted jewellery. Obviously there's baking, there's jams and chutneys, personalised crafts, there's hats, there's handbags, painted stones. There is a great mix of variety, and that'll be seen throughout all the rooms within the centre. You won't pass by two stalls the same, so I'm sure there's going to be plenty to choose from, and there should be no problem at all buying plenty of gifts for Christmas.
John, I see a big asterisk beside the handbag thing there. If that's any help for you there.
Is that a hint, Peter? Thanks for that. It was probably going to be left out later on for me. So I suppose the great thing, like we say, is that once you come in, you can go down. So it's not only going to be what used to be before. When you came in, it was just the main hall and what we refer to here in the centre as the HSE room. So it's going to be basically all the rooms from the very start to the very end are going to have stalls. So just to remind you folks, if you do come, make sure you walk down the whole centre. And we'll have the music playing in around the centre as well. We're going to try to get the lads where you can hear the songs throughout the whole centre. So we'll the choir, I suppose, is another, like the choir has always been a great part of our fair here. So hopefully they'll be back this year, will they?
Yes, I was speaking to Carl this morning, so the choir are practising tonight, and she'll mention it to them, but she reckons, yes, definitely they'll be on for coming back to the centre here to start the fair off on the Sunday morning.
Brilliant. The fair, in my opinion, over the last, from 2019 and for the previous, I'd say it's probably about 7 years that the fair was running. It really kicks off Christmas here in Castledermot. So it's really important, I think anyway, and I'm sure all our listeners will agree, that it's really important that the fair is back. And would you both agree with me with that? Would you agree that it's really an integral part of Castledermot now going forward?
Well, it is more a social occasion than like it's a fundraiser for the centre, but I think people get more out of the social aspect of it, of meeting, and I think it goes back to our very first one, the first year we were here in the centre. I think the centre opened September, October, and the Christmas fair was the first opportunity for a lot of people to get in and get a look at it, and that was an amazing day, and people still use it to catch up with friends and family. So it's a two-pronged thing. It's fundraiser and the social aspect of it, which we are a community centre at the end of the day, so that's very important in its own right.
All right, thanks Peter, and thanks so much to Siobhan and Peter for coming in this evening just to give us an update on the fair. So it's on the 3rd and 4th of, it's the weekend of the 3rd and 4th. The 3rd is the drive-through, and the 4th is the fair itself and the drive-through. But I suppose before I do leave ye or let you go, another part of the fair was always the Christmas raffle, and people coming in are used to walking in through the door and seeing Kevin Kelly sitting behind the table and seeing Dick Kaplis walking around selling lines and selling tickets. So will we have a raffle this year?
We surely will, and raffle cards will be distributed throughout the town tomorrow morning and be left here in the centre as well. So you can buy your ticket over the next couple of weeks, but equally it'll be on sale here during the Christmas fair itself, and the raffle will take place at the end of the Christmas fair. We'll have loads of hampers and loads of prizes, so yeah, definitely always worth throwing a few bob at.
Very good, very good. So thanks a million for coming in again, and thanks a million to Ger before you for coming on tonight. Just a couple of things just before I finish up. First of all, Peter, I just want to say it's great to see you back open again, and congratulations on reopening. It's a great facility in the town. And I know from the end of the town we live in, it's great that you're back open. So just delighted to see that.
Just on that, John, thanks very much, and thanks to the people of Castledermot for supporting us. And on Saturday morning, if there's anyone passing, we're doing a few bits and pieces. Radio Castledermot are coming up and broadcasting for an hour or two. We'll have little giveaways and a few treats for people coming and going. So if you're passing anytime Saturday morning, call in and say hello. Thanks.
Okay, so Saturday morning, the place to be is up in Beans, the top of the town. So you've heard it here first on Radio Castledermot. And just before I finish up, on my last show 2 weeks ago, we had Nicola Mooney and Jess Mooney on and Margaret Kinsella, and they spoke about David. And David was meant to have his operation on the 9th of November. And unfortunately, that was postponed. But it's now scheduled for Wednesday, the 23rd of November. So just to give you an update on that. So this Wednesday, David should be going in for his operation. And on behalf of all of us here in Radio Castledermot, and I know on behalf of all the listeners, we wish David well, and Nicola and the girls all the best. So that's from everybody here from Radio Castledermot and all our listeners. And just to give you a reminder of the shows coming up this week. So tomorrow night we have an extra show, and the Great Fuzzy is on from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock tomorrow night, so don't miss out on that. On Wednesday you have Leo, and Leo will get you over the hump again from 7 to 10. Ger will be here on Thursday with Throwback Thursday, and just a congratulations to Ger as well on the award that he received last week for his fundraising efforts and all the work that he does in Carlow. So a huge shout out there to Ger. And Fuzzy will be back here on Friday with his Country and Irish show. On Saturday night is, as always, it's party night here on Radio Castledermot. And on Sunday afternoon, Leo is back with the Sunday mix from 3 to 6. And don't forget that on Saturday morning, the lads will be up in Bean's Garage. So for a few giveaways up there on Saturday morning. So that's just something else to look forward to. So I'll be back here in 2 weeks' time. And as always, we're going to talk about what matters and what matters to you, the listeners, what matters to the people of Castledermot. So thanks a million to everybody for tuning in tonight. A huge thank you to Ger, who came in and to talk about his book. Like I said earlier, you can get it in seasons. An absolute brilliant read. I would recommend it to everybody. So if you haven't already got it, you can get it in seasons and you can get it online. And we will put up the link for it. So I'm going to leave you now. Thanks again to everybody for listening.
You're listening to What Matters on Radio Castledermot with John Phelan.